Welcome, and thank you for joining us. This is a little different today for our Soul Path sessions, I'm Brenda Littleton, and I'm going to be interviewing our very own Deborah Mines Pearson in looking at the launch of her new book of poetry, Shelter in Place. So I'm going to use this time to really get intimate with Deborah's goals and desires, and wanting to talk about what launched the book, where it came from. I've been privy to being able to read through all of it, and I have some favorites. I have an opening, just an opening comment, Deborah, and just I want to thank you for, during this time of COVID, during this time of who we are in the world, to bring out this book. So thank you.
You're welcome. I thank the universe. I really do. You're welcome.
I got the feeling even from the foreword where you say, as a therapist and spiritual life coach, I work with clients who experience anxiety or pain. And then you drop down and say, I experience my vulnerability as unavoidable reality that helps me connect deeply with myself and others. So this, in many ways, is a tribute to your work as a therapist, and the voices I hear in the poems. I thought we're going to be primarily a therapist and reflecting this time of COVID, but I also hear other tender underbellies, such as a daughter, a mother, a lover, wife, and equally, what speaks loudly to me is that the animist, both the protector of nature as strength, but also you have some points in here that just rip my heart out about protecting nature in its most vulnerable, and then equating nature in its most vulnerable with us as human beings in our most vulnerable times. Can you say a little bit about where do you want to start? Because this is your baby, and I know you've been a poet for a very long time. Your practice is based on poetry. I've heard clients say that you've saved their life based on your ushering and stewarding them into poetry. And now you have your own contribution for all of us.
Yeah. So, yeah, as a very young person, I mean, poetry always was a go-to, even like an anthology in my home, in my childhood home, of favorite poets that would just say it. Poetry is sculpture to me. It's getting rid of all that's unnecessary, to just pierce right into the heart and to bring a true connection that we recognize instantly. So it wasn't, in retrospect, it's not too surprising to me that before I knew we were going to have, any of us knew that we were going to be in a pandemic situation, my soul knew it. And I had this awakening. So really where I begin is with the very first poem, which is called Awakening, because it was supernatural. I mean, it was supernatural. It was natural and it was heightened. So to me, poetry is both heightened and extremely grounded because everything has its opposite. And what I found is as I let go in nature for this first poem in the early morning, in February 2020, these lines came to me, which I would like to open with, is that first poem, because I was sitting outside in Sedona in Boynton Canyon. So I'm just kind of setting the stage a little bit, that I felt very quiet in the early morning hours and was in this most sacred canyon and to the native peoples of this region. And absolutely in this quietness, I took dictation. As a poet, I edited the dictation, but not too much. It was mostly a scramble to get it written down so I could learn from it. And I would have to say what makes this book more unique than other poetry I've written, well, for the most part, is that it was dictation and it was obedience to a part of me that was going to go through an experience. In the same way, I feel it is obedience to share it to a greater self. Okay, does that make sense? So
It does. Yeah.
So I'm part of something. I'm caught up in the swell of something. So the first poem was written pretty much near dawn, and it describes the scene, awakening. And this beauty knocks hard on the door of my heart. The mind and its designs are too small for this moment. Your frame of reference is no frame at all. An updraft holds the hawk high and still between the canyon walls. Where are you going? Accept this quiet is your awakening. This line, the mind and its designs are too small for this moment, became the refrain throughout this. It's still this way.
Yeah.
This mind is a servant in this setting, not the master. It's no frame at all. Getting rid of frames of reference. Little did I know. I mean, I literally wrote this down, Brenda. I had no idea really what it meant, except that it was correct.
So in looking back after 2.5 years, I mean, my takeaway, my little notes on it was like, there was the call to knowing that being is enough, like you in that moment. And I know that canyon, and I can imagine the hawk, and the updraft basically anointing you or giving you the physical representation of the download.
Showing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Be like the hawk in that it's enough.
The hawk, of course, soared between two big, beautiful, it was a vortice. So between two structures and found support. So it was showing support, like the updraft will hold, but you must have your wings out. You must be willing, you must seek it. It was the words come second. We've talked about this. The words are very secondary to the feeling.
It does, and this poem does act like a form of enunciation. And I'm going back into my professorial literature, that whole language, but it is structured in a way to announce all of the other forms of recognizing one's support throughout the book. I mean, you bring in very tender moments of recognition. Some are cloaked deeper in hidden meaning than others. But the takeaway is, even in this scenario, the mind is not enough. The being, the animistic, the spirit, the knowing is all that you have to do. I mean, it's hard. I'm not simplifying it, but it's what's required at this time. And also the idea is that the challenge is coming out of shelter in place is that when you're going into your office, going into looking at nature, going into a client, going into a lover, it was like all of these prior experiences, these day-to-day normalized, dependable experiences now became the tender underbelly, like the longing. What used to be so common, now there's a longing. There's echoes of longing in most of these poems.
Yeah, I've had some feedback from people who don't typically read poetry, and they'll tell me, "Oh yeah, it's kind of depressing." But I take that like, yeah, we were pressed down. Okay, so And that's the part that is really important that surprised me is that it doesn't stay down.
No.
All the poems talk about I'm down because of my model of how it should be, my framework, my frame of reference. And that's the thing. We have to go through this human experience, and we have to don the mask. We have to have the ego. And part of the beauty of human existence is it breaking and not being able. And to me, shelter in place is really that breaking down of the ego structure and the beauty of that, not to leap over it and say, I'm so glad I'm in nature because, gee, isn't it swell that I can be in nature? It's like I broke down. And when I broke down, to quote Khalil Gibran, the shell that enclosed my understanding opened. So yeah, it's depressing. Like you press a seed into the earth, and with enough heat, time, and pressure, that seed opens. And during the opening, is it pleasant? No, it's a birth. Hurts like hell. You don't know what's happening. You're changing form. So the surrender, I think for a lot of people who don't plumb the depths of who they really are, poetry can be seen as terrifying because it will break you before it opens you.
It's from a different perspective, and that's what I appreciate about this collection of poetry is that, well, I can understand how someone may say they might have felt a visitor of depression when reading it, but for me it was more of, oh, you're showing us how to sit in this perspective and look all the way around that room. We're not going to dash in and dash out and ignore it. We're going to sit here and be present. We're going to awaken to that moment. We're going to, the mind and its designs are too small for this moment. So where does that live? And so I took the opening poem as an entree into every other poem is going to have this element alive in the poem. And so when I'm reading about, the lake or the doe and the mother and the lover and the client, and it's just like, where is that moment that she's asking us to look for? And you actually, it's like having that miner's light on where you look and that light shines and we can see it. And it's like, oh, there she is. That's where she wants us to look. It's great.
Absolutely. I felt much more like E.T. When I think of the visual representation is when the heart light came on, I could see.
Yeah.
So it's definitely a drop. The mind is used. Obviously I'm speaking and I'm noticing, but it's the heart light. It's visual. It's a visual representation, that extraterrestrial, that soul that inhabits this body, that spirit that inhabits this body, that gets so caught up in how the storyline should go, and the emotional layers that we must experience to turn the heart light on and the soul light.
Because of this complexity, the natural embodiment of the soul light and the heart light and the tenderness. And to me, most of the poems, when I was reading them, I could hear you speaking and I was thinking, oh, these are like tender soliloquies. These are you talking to your higher spirit speaking to you. And I saw, and I thought it was intentional because I know you had a particular editor, and yet I also saw in the book very, very, very slim use of any punctuation as far as commas for clauses. So it seemed almost like a dream sphere, like things were coming at, and instead of having a comma and a pause and a clause, it was more of this is what you're experiencing and we're going there with you. It's not like Joyce where there's no, just one after another, but there was these moments that the reader was asked to pause on their own. And also some titles were capitalized, some titles were small. And I thought there is a message here, there is, we're being brought through the poetry in these very subtle directions because the content itself requires us to step and wait, and then that miner's light showing is like, where does she want me to look? Like, what does she
Mhm.
want me to see? Oh,
Mhm.
okay, I get it. Yeah, I
Mhm.
thought it was very
Mhm.
well done that way.
Ah, I'm glad to
Yeah.
hear that. And I would say I love it because I'm almost listening like a third party because you're describing something that I hadn't really thought about because I was bringing it in to every
Yeah.
person I've ever been and ever will be was telling me how it should be. So it's interesting to hear
So,
that experience because
yeah.
it was pretty unconscious. It was just like, oh, that's right. That's right. Like if you were decorating a room and you put that pillow there and you say, oh, that's right. I couldn't tell you why
Yeah.
it's right. I can just tell you it's right.
Yeah.
And
It's a
it
book
does
of
feel
feeling.
like, mhm,
It's orchestrated well based on the pacing and the bringing me in, keeping
yeah.
me in the midst of it, and then bringing me out. And you have those different sections as well.
Mhm, mhm,
There are several poems I would love to unpack. I don't know if we're
mhm.
going to do them all in this particular
No,
session, but
yeah.
starting at what I would call the lightest level, the joyous level. For me, my favorite one of love is good to the last drop.
Oh,
And
that's a very funny one, actually.
it
Um,
is, it is. And I just burst out in smiles and laughter. And I just thought, oh, but just the tenderness, the way your warm back presses against mine. Who doesn't have that memory?
yeah,
Would you be open to reading this? This is short, but it's
absolutely.
so,
Yeah, and I want
so
to do a little
lovely.
preface. I want to do a little preface. I was this was an early poem, so these were not all in chronological order. But my husband and I were hiking actually in Sedona. We didn't bring enough water and we got horribly lost. And as our way, when something goes wrong, we tend to blame it on each other. We didn't invent that method. Uh, like, why didn't you bring your own water bottle? Well, why are you blaming me? And we were just really dehydrated and it turned quite nasty. So, and then it resolved. Okay. So what was funny, this poem is, I would call this poem humility because it's written of what happened. I would ask anybody to look in a real relationship. There can be these harsh moments where you're right. And then there are these moments where the heart light comes on and you see the bigger picture. And so that's what this poem really is about. So I'll go ahead and read it.
Thank you.
Good to the last drop. The way your warm back presses against mine, the reassuring hold of our small bed, and sleepy comfort of our private thoughts. The steady economy of your quiet movement bringing me my morning coffee. Yesterday, you got lost. We walked until there was a hole in your sock. This morning, a small sock on the table. I was so angry at you, forgetting all you do. Forgetting I write this poem for you.
It just makes me cry.
I got verklempt reading it. And the turning point for me is that hole in that sock is what is the most
That's
humble
what got
thing.
me. Yeah. And because I always equate the double entendre, the sock covers the soul is the flesh against the earth, soul to soul. I go into my depth world, but and so when I got his soul, his hole in his soul, and I just thought, oh, and good to the last drop. Yeah,
Good to the last drop.
yeah, it's just beautiful.
I would say there's
Thank you.
sometimes, when I was a kid, and even now, I think funerals or celebrations of life, as they call them now, but this is where poetry happens so much of the time, where unconsciously we know what matters, or consciously, and this poem is a celebration of life. I saw the small things about him that are so precious to me. And I saw it before I'm standing at the graveside, which is a great gift. Mm-hmm.
there is that theme running through the book of hindsight and seeing the great gifts. And with that particular poem, I was hosting Emily Dickinson here. I said, did you see what Deborah did? This is kind of a tribute, an homage to you. Yeah, because
I love
felt
that. I just saw that
don't
movie.
you think? Yeah.
Yeah, well, I love that movie. I just saw it. Wonderful. I mean, and she was one of my very favorite quiet poets. A quiet with a drum. You know, quiet with a drum. Yeah,
So
it's wonderful.
one of the two major themes here is being at the post grave and looking back at the lessons, but also being an active therapist. And this book carries the soliloquy of a therapist, not case notes, but heart notes. Not only in talking about going to your empty office and seeing the echoes there, but also in this poem. This is the fourth chapter. Here I seek silence.
Oh yeah.
And can you give me a little background on that? Am I off in saying that this is a tribute and an homage to being a therapist or to a client that you've been working with?
Absolutely. In fact, there's so much in it because therapists need therapists. I think this was a great admission in this book, which sometimes is it's sort of a disappointment, almost like you've got to present this self that is invincible. And so I was sharing with whoever wants to know what we do. And there are particular lines in there that had to be just precise to capture it, especially the image of the lotus and how it gets pulled under. You see this bright face, but there's so much underneath that you wouldn't want to look at, or it feeds from the muddy bottom and it drifts and it's unprotected. And so I have a therapist friend who said this book is really courageous because we have to walk this line between giving ourselves entirely to the process of the other person, actually drifting with them, and being mindful of our own transference, countertransference, emptiness. And this poem was written in the summer of 2020 when, like many of my colleagues, we forgot that we had boundaries. And we worked frontline with clients, I think in part because we needed to have a sense of control or agency with them to help be present, because there was so much that wasn't there. And I was fortunate to have this little sweet lake house, which was bequeathed to my husband by his grandmother and sits right on the edge of a lake. I can almost fall into it. And so this poem was written after a session where I was completely without boundaries and came out of the lake aware in the present moment. Okay.
Yeah.
And became aware of the great injury.
And it spoke to me as a therapist, as well as the use of fractals and how that image aligned me into the multiplicit roles a person fits and fills all the time. And the sense of it is self-organizing. It is a sense of chaos, but it is a predictable, unpredictability that is present. And I thought you captured the process as well as your reflection all together in this small piece. So I would love for you to share.
Thank you. I just got to say before I share it, people that do not write poetry or appreciate poetry don't know what this poem is about. People who write and appreciate poetry, so far, feedback. And so I had said to my editor, who happened to be my daughter, who's a wonderful editor, that we just fell into that. I said, I think I need to explain this. So I'd written another poem that was quite prosaic. She's like, no, because I had gotten rid of this poem. I actually had to find this poem in the trash bin. She said, don't you dare get rid of this poem. She's a poet. She says, don't you dare get rid of this poem. It's so visual. It's so felt. So I found it. I was so grateful. So this is a poem I could have been called Lost and Found as well.
Well, I like Here I Seek Silence. And again, the topography choice is such that the title is in lowercase.
Mm-hmm.
So there's, it's kind of a, oh, by the way, it's kind of like perhaps kind of a nonchalant moment of clarity. And I love that.
Yeah, I think for me, it would be less nonchalance and more quietness, because lowercase for me is the quietness that is the gift. The quietness that speaks so loudly. So I thank you for that. I mean, I think we all open it to our own interpretation, but I do know I related to shh. Okay, this poem for me has a lot of that in it. Yeah. So I'll go ahead and read it.
Thank you.
Here I seek silence, generous and demanding as the sun. This true moment in the wide lift of the heron's wing, the sudden thrash of sleeping carp from my kayak's drifting blade. You know my depths, the way I chord to another, allowing their stories to pull me under. Like the lotus whose bright face turns toward the light, alluring as the moon, yet cold unto itself, tangled root, dark, drifting. This deep listening, will your mother live another night on ventilated breath? Will your mother live another night on ventilated breath? Will your husband choose to drink? My labored listening is harbor till you find a shore. The paddle pulls against the evening lake, cleanly divides fractals, moving water. Separate me from these urgencies. Separate me from these urgencies, these fraught moments that bind me to them, or toward the unnamed self. Last sunlight's neon beam brightens before sleep. That last image, I'm looking out across right now and I can actually see the sedges. And this is a very accurate description of what happens to the sedges along the lake's edge when the sun is setting around 10 o'clock at night in the Pacific Northwest. They just become neon.
Yeah.
And they woke me up. And they had to end it on a brighter note. Yeah.
The line that caught my heart was the way I chord to another, allowing their story to pull me under.
Yeah.
And this could be written in a critical pedagogy lecture for therapists coming into the world. This is what happens. Yeah.
I think that's the great difference between people who are natural healers and empaths and those who are schooled to become therapists, because there is a great fear I found in my years as a person who shepherded new therapists into this profession. As an empath, we do get courted and we learn how to work with that as therapists. As a supervisor, I found people who said, give me the technique that allows me not to do that. And to a certain extent, yeah, I would say, no, I'll give you the technique that helps you keep one foot on dry land. But I cannot guarantee that you won't find times where you go under. I will help you find the dry land. If it's a
Jung
deep breath.
Jung, similar to that is Jung saying a therapist, a guide, can only take their clients as far as the work they've done and gone themselves. So a therapist can only go as far with a client as far as they've gone on their own journey. So it's
very true. And the artistry of, I would say a poet therapist to me is like one word, because so much of what we do is imagery and knowing. We receive things. Everyone receives internal pictures, but there is a certain lostness, like as represented in this poem, where I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm just with you.
Mhm.
I know the work I've done on myself and my own intuition about what you need in that moment must cord together at some point. And it's a miracle, like these poems are a miracle. The word mirror, to be shown what needs to happen in this moment. It's very much by the seat of your pants profession, as far as I have seen for almost 40 years.
Yeah.
Seat of your pants, very similar to improv when I was an actress. You know, you've got to go with the other person, say yes.
It's a dance. Yeah.
It's a dance.
Yeah.
So,
And and I think I'm sure you've experienced it when clients find you, much of their work, if you haven't done the work yourself, it will activate your own work, or those memories, those echoes of like, oh yeah, I remember, or oh yes, here we go. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there's a
it's
saying that whatever you need to be working on will walk through the door.
Yeah.
So that's part of the every long-term therapist I have ever talked to has recognized this. Oh, you're working on boundaries. Here comes somebody who's really has a pretty similar problem to yours, and there's an invitation to kick it up a notch. You know, to really walk the walk. So energetically, you can embody the terror, the lostness, the finding, and the courage to go to that next expansion of your own self. It's a fierce profession.
It is a fierce profession. And speaking of fierceness and the sense of vulnerability and defending, going into another voice. I mean, you've had distinct characters throughout the book, but the one of the animist, the defender, or perhaps the steward of nature being both strong, overwhelming, and also vulnerable. But I see and I hear your sense of defending, and yet also being part of the threat, being vulnerable yourself by witnessing in the poem, breezy lake, deserted but for two small boats.
Oh man.
And it's that's where you are there. So I can tell you're already feeling that memory. Yeah,
I am. That was, this was during the time where, I mean, fortunately, we're doing something positive with all the injustices. But that summer of 2020, everything exploded, and there was a very strong sense of, there still is in our country, of division, different ways of seeing people of color, women. It's still going on, and it's very easy to typify or be terrified by the other who comes from a different standpoint. So this poem actually broadens out in a way that surprised me. But I was literally looking across at the island across from me, and this is just a description of what happened when I saw people who represented to me the violence in our country. Okay, I don't know if they were this at all, but it needed to come up for me. And so it just gathered in this poem of like, they're here, the awful ones who would kill the innocent, who would attack, and so that's what this poem's about. So I will read it. It's rather a devastating poem, actually.
it is. But I love the last line. It's just like, oh, again, it was beautiful walking us through, getting us used to the scenery, being comfortable with the topic. And then where does Deborah want us to, where is that light being shown? And then it was like, oh God, oh, I know that feeling. So it was.
Yeah, it brought it up strongly. So here we go. Walk with me. Breezy lake, deserted, but for two small boats. The doe and her fawn grazing on the island's edge catch the eye of the men who float near the shore. The doe springs into the forest. The fawn she protects now alone stands curious, unafraid as the taut bow aims, soft-eyed innocence, still spotted, nature's camouflage undone by naivete. Binoculars in hand, I run to the yard, helpless as a fawn to stop them, powerless except prayer. Hold a different conversation in your heart, please. The white cowboy hat, the whiskey bottle, 6 men and 1 little life. The boats motor away. The fawn steps into the trees and disappears. My violence is fear. I understand something of those who would walk unprotected in the streets.
Wow. Glorious. Yeah, that defines it. My violence is fear. It is. Yeah, I can own that one, and you do it so well.
The receiving of this. So again, I'm joining with you. I received it and I wrote it down, which I'd like to encourage our listeners to do, because I do think this is a quality that we possess to know when something is heartfelt and meaningful. Yeah. George Floyd had just happened, and all the other deaths, and this little fawn, and the fires, and all the things, and this sensitivity to that one little life represented all the lives and the unconsciousness.
And observing it, like being the observer, feeling that you were engaged, and then realizing on a pivot what was at risk, and also that sense of vulnerability, but yet powerless, other than holding that prayer.
Yeah, that was it. And the energy going across that lake was absolute surrender, but also some deeper part that just sent out a blast of light from my chest to whatever would happen would have a blessing. Like if I were there at the death of someone that was so innocent, that I know in the last moments I would be in prayer for the whole scene. That's a larger sense of self that came alive and has been more alive with the great suffering. Yeah, that compassion will visit. And courage that I will walk when I'm called to walk. And I will have a voice for the innocent. It will not be, though, as it was prior. It's not a resting place to be in violence. It is a resting place to understand vulnerability. So that word vulnerability is growing stronger. Whatever you're doing with your whiskey bottle and your arrow is your story. What I'm doing, the fear, I'm realizing must come from a place of deep vulnerability about what I must do.
And equally in the room, like equally taking up space. It's not a back seat. It's not an observer. It is a participation. You are showing up. Yeah. So it's a beautiful poem to show, even in this moment of something quick and passing as a fawn going into at that risk of losing its life, but moving safely into the forest. That metaphor for how else this is lived every single day in our lives.
Yes. And I think the miracle that I just was, there had to be a moment where the person who was such an easy shot to shoot innocence. And there was a reconciliation of the innocence, or it's not worth it. I mean, this is a baby. I mean, it's so obvious this is a baby. But just that somehow through the drunkenness, the seeming drunkenness, who knows what I actually saw? Because they have just I know they were there, and I know that I saw the arrow, and I know I saw that. But there seems to be an alchemy inside that person where I don't care if that person is looking at a person of color or a woman or any kind of social change or a trans person, and they just see we not just they, we see innocence. We see the baby. we see that would be the final miracle to me, or one of the final miracles, is that we would see our innocence with one another. And it would just,
As opposed, yeah, sorry. I was just thinking of, I was following you when the person who had the arrow, who had the opportunity to take what they thought they deserved, that sense of entitlement, passing some old past habits. But in that moment, if we were to follow your guidance, switched, pivot, alchemized into, instead of seeing something that I can take, into something I can honor because it's innocence, if that makes sense. It's
absolutely. I mean, on the if I want to be like we do in our dream work, if I want to be the person in the cowboy hat,
yeah.
it's much more of a heart moment. I went from into here. This is a baby. I woke up. It's a curious baby. You don't shoot a curious baby. That wouldn't be the right movement. Just that little turn of heart, and my lasso of love sending it out there, and anger and hurt.
And fear. So we've been having little steps moving into vulnerability, but strength and empowerment, and a shift in what's important. The shift of brushing away and dashing away to staying, lingering, being observant, really getting into a material that often is too easy or easier to just let one ignore. The last poem that I'd like to refer to is closer in. It's again embodying all the steps that we've been taking. But in this poem, The Balloon, I hear a daughter, or I hear a family member. And it is so tender and poignant. And I wonder, are you willing to read it at this time?
If I wrote it, I can read it. Okay. Because it's the very act of being willing to share this. I would like to add context, because I think it would help the listener. I participated in a Jonathan Young mythic, and Anne, I'll think of her name. But they have this beautiful series of mythic stories and imagination immersion class, and they were covering It's a Wonderful Life. And anyone who knows me knows that my first initiation was the suicide of my father. And if you've ever seen It's a Wonderful Life, it's dealing with this topic. So it was the topic was suicide and the soul. And as the day got thicker and thicker, and they told the story, Jonathan will stop at particular points and allow the participants to weigh in on what's happening to them. So towards the end of the day, Anne, who's a poet, and whose my memory is just I'm gonna forgive myself for not remembering her last name right now. That's just one of my glitchy things. But she invited us, as she always does, to write a quick poem in 5 minutes. So I would invite the listener, the viewer, to think about this, because many times that critic gets going, and we think poetry is this grand thing, or writing is such a grand thing, and we all know as writers that we just start to write, and we allow it. But because the heart energy was so large and it's so open, this poem flew out of me, and it actually refers to one of my earliest memories as maybe a 3-year-old. And then it resolves into my later initiation with my father's suicide. So I'm going to lead it into it that way.
Thank you.
Balloon. Impossibly blue as a world with swirls of white. Daddy, you are home. Your suit smells of iron. You've been to Mexico and thought of me, a gift exotic, precious. I push my balloon higher and higher, laughing, chasing, unbridled relief that you're safe. Oh, my balloon hits the acoustic ceiling with a tragic pop. I can't stop crying. you try to console me, but you don't understand. My tears are for you. I have ruined your joy. You will never know that I have failed you, popped your generosity, spent your gift until my wedding, when the cost of it, a frivolous expense in the midst of your hopelessness, makes you end it all. But this time, I blame you because I was your unbreakable gift. I was your unbreakable gift.
And there's no period here. It goes on and on and on and on.
Mhm.
There's no end. I mean, it really contributes to the sense of the initiation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
This poem surprised me because the balloon just floated up. The image that the fragility of it, the world of it, the sudden tragic popping of it. You see, our subconscious minds know the image. If we'll just let them up, we have this ability. We don't understand. So often when I'm working with a client, they'll have an image. I'll say, go with it. I didn't know this would not go away. And it became a world. And it became my world that popped twice. But the second time, I saw that I was precious. The first popping, he was precious. And I chased him. And the second popping, I came home to myself and what I had lost. And I didn't know that because the narrative of It's a Wonderful Life is the father didn't kill himself. He came back and he picked up his little girl and he's laughing and Clarence gets his wings and it's all good. And so my inner child was listening to this narrative and her longing to, because you did pick up on that thread, wrote this poem. And I do think brokenhearted people write poetry, and I do think mystics write poetry from that place of brokenhearted longing and finding. There's a brokenhearted joy in poetry.
Yeah.
Or wonder. I think wonder is a better word. A brokenhearted wonder, which makes it worthwhile.
All of it. I mean, this particular collection is a container for weaving the joy, the wonder, the grief, the sorrow, the ability to have it all. It's not the duality, which I find with my clients so many is like, how do I not get sad? How do I get back to glad? And it's like, no, this is all, you won't find glad until you find sad, until being, and you're showing us a way here. You've shown your way. And you've shown how someone else who perhaps is looking for a way through or in can follow and know that they will make it and know that it is the path that one has to. It's there. It's not so much finding it as it is, as you're in your opening poem, allowing it, accepting it.
Right on. There's not a resolution in one feeling. I mean, there is maybe faith is the word for this year. I mean, for me, after writing this, that to me is a much more important, like David White talks about, that having faith even when the moon fades from fullness, becoming that last, possible little arc of light. To me, that is more the wisdom that comes through living, is that when I'm in grief, it's going to include more this revolution. I'm going to remember when I came back into my different iterations of my own reflection or refraction of the light. And I'm more interested. So I'm holding levels. To me, it's about holding levels. So as I'm grieving, I'm holding that I will come back. And this part is interesting too. Without to do something, music, art, poetry, compassion, these all come from having experienced the fading from fullness and coming back into fullness. the journey.
And getting great resource from being in nature as well, finding
We are nature.
And your capturing of the fractals of just the water coming off your paddle and seeing the different the different boundaries, and now you're slipping into here, and now you're slipping into here, and it's getting great resourcing and direction on if I follow that hawk, if I am that doe, if I am that fractal of water, I am well.
If I can dissolve into it as well. It's like yesterday I was at the beach on a beautiful day in the Pacific Northwest, and there were beautiful moments where I had no thoughts.
This leads
there.
Yeah, the one narrow thought. Was that the one that you were thinking of? The one narrow thought?
Yes.
Because the last line of it, when I am bitter, I think such things. When I am better, your mind is not my prison.
Yeah.
There's that one, but there's the one about, I could go on. Is there a poem that you would like to share that I haven't touched on? Well, there's many.
I know there's different ones for different times.
Yes.
And I think this one, it's a simple little poem. I wrote it when I came back to the desert, and I was in a completely different landscape. And I was quite disoriented after I'd sheltered in place in the Pacific Northwest in our little blue house, grandma's house, and came back to the desert, which felt quite sere. And I was trying to find my footing because we still weren't touching each other. We were still quite isolated. And so in this lostness, I just sent out, prayer to myself that I would come awake in a natural way. And so it was very early in the morning for me. I'm not always an early awakener because I'm not a great sleeper, but I woke up around 5:30 and I just had to get out of bed. And I trusted the direction to put on shorts instead of a hoodie, to head for the canyon. And to me, one of the most beautiful sacred places I visit is the Indian canyons. And so this poem was my reintroduction to the landscape. I couldn't find home until I came here. And it also talks about the calculating mind. I'd been very caught up when I get anxious, and I don't think I'm alone in this, of the part of me that's the accountant. How much have I done? How much do I have yet to do? Where am I on the scale? And this was a sweeping away and an introduction to my life in the desert. And this morning I felt the new grasses. So they were my teacher and instructor. So I'll read that one in closing. This morning I felt the new grasses pushing me up from sleep toward quiet canyon waters, sandy steps, bird call, and falling date fruit. There are apps on my phone to tell me how far I've walked, how much fat I've burned, carbs I've burned. But this morning's call is for creek water, not counting. The measure of a waterfall whose inevitable course of surrender and flow is my instructor. Surrender and flow.
Yeah. Starting with awakening.
Yeah.
Accept this quiet is your awakening.
Yes.
And where are you going? Yeah. So this little book of poetry is a beautiful journey. And I want to thank you for gifting it to the world, Deborah.
Well, I appreciate that, Brenda. And I appreciate, this feels like a baptism to me. When you give birth to a baby and then someone cares enough to anoint that baby and wish the best for that baby. So I receive this, and I thank you for the anointing, for bringing this baby out and putting it in this lace dress and putting the water on her head and heart, because that's how it really feels to me, as a blessing.
Okay. Well, I've been waiting to spend some time with you on your creation, and I'm hoping that there'll be more opportunities for others to also host you. And I'd love to see a future launch where you can actually just sit and read your book and in front of a larger audience, perhaps on Zoom as well. So let's work toward that.
I love
I will
it.
sign it here and then we'll pick up. But I want to thank you so much for this time and the baptism of shelter in place with Deborah Mines Pearson. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brenda Littleton. I love you loads. Thank you.